Narcissism: How to Identify and Escape Toxic People Forever by the Audiobook Space. There is someone in your life who makes you feel like you are never enough, never right, never good enough. And no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you give, how much you sacrifice, how much of yourself you pour into keeping the peace, it is never enough. And somehow, every single argument, every single conflict, every single difficult moment between you ends with you apologizing for something they did. If that sentence just landed somewhere specific in your chest, if a face appeared in your mind the moment I said it, this audiobook experience was made for you. Because what you are describing is not a difficult relationship. It is not a communication problem. It is not a compatibility issue that more effort will solve. What you are describing has a name. And understanding that name, understanding the psychology behind it, the tactics it uses, the damage it causes, and the path out of it is the most important thing you will do for yourself this year. Narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is a formally recognized clinical condition listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, an overwhelming need for admiration, and a profound and persistent lack of empathy for other people. But the clinical definition, precise and important as it is, does not capture what it actually feels like to be in a relationship with a narcissist. It does not capture the confusion, the self-doubt, the exhaustion of constantly trying to meet standards that shift without warning, the strange grief of loving someone who seems incapable of loving you back in any form that resembles what love is actually supposed to feel like. Narcissistic personality disorder exists on a spectrum. At its most severe, it is a debilitating condition with profound consequences for everyone in the narcissist's orbit. At its subclinical level, what researchers call narcissistic traits rather than full disorder, it manifests as patterns of behavior that are damaging and recognizable even without a formal diagnosis. For the purposes of this audiobook experience, we are going to focus on something broader and more practically useful than the clinical diagnostic criteria. We're going to focus on the patterns, the behaviors, the dynamics, the specific ways that highly narcissistic people, whether formally diagnosed or not, operate in relationships, families, workplaces, and social environments. Because the diagnostic label matters less than the pattern recognition. You do not need a clinical diagnosis to recognize that a relationship is damaging you. You do not need a certificate in psychology to understand that the way someone treats you is not acceptable. And you do not need anyone's permission to protect yourself from behavior that is destroying your sense of self. Today, we are going to give you 12 things, 12 dimensions of narcissism, what it is, how it operates, what it does to the people around it, and how you find your way out. This is the audiobook experience that millions of people needed years before they found it. Chapter 1. What narcissism actually is beyond the selfie stereotype. The popular understanding of narcissism is almost entirely wrong. When most people hear the word narcissist, they picture someone who takes too many selfies, someone who talks about themselves too much at dinner parties, someone who is vain, self-absorbed, and mildly annoying. That is not narcissism. Narcissism, at its clinical and subclinical levels, is something far more complex, far more damaging, and far less immediately visible than the popular caricature suggests. The term comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus, the beautiful young man who fell so completely in love with his own reflection in a pool of water that he could not leave it, and eventually wasted away and died staring at himself. But the psychological reality of narcissism is not simply self-love. In fact, the most current research suggests that narcissism is not really about self-love at all. It is about self-protection. Beneath the grandiosity, beneath the entitlement, beneath the contempt and the manipulation and the constant need for admiration, there is almost always a profound and deeply buried sense of inadequacy, shame, and vulnerability that the narcissistic personality structure was built to protect. The narcissist's grandiosity is not confidence, it is armor, built early, usually in childhood, in response to environments that were either excessively critical or excessively indulgent without genuine attunement, as a defense against an unbearable felt sense of worthlessness. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior. It does not make the damage less real, and it does not mean that the narcissist is a victim whose manipulation should be tolerated. But it explains why the behavior is so resistant to change, why confrontation almost never produces genuine accountability, why appeals to empathy almost never work, why the relationship almost never becomes what you need it to be, no matter how patient, how accommodating, how loving you are. Because the narcissistic personality structure was built precisely to prevent the kind of vulnerability that genuine change requires. Psychologists identified two primary subtypes of narcissism. Grandiose narcissism, the more recognizable type, characterized by overt self-aggrandizement, a sense of superiority, entitled behavior, and a confident, domineering interpersonal style. This is the narcissist who walks into a room and immediately seeks to establish their dominance, who name drops relentlessly, who talks over people and assumes their opinion is the most important in any conversation. Vulnerable narcissism, far less recognized and far more commonly encountered in close relationships, characterized by hypersensitivity to criticism, a victim mentality, passive-aggressive behavior, and an intense need for reassurance, combined with a deeply held sense of specialness and entitlement that is expressed not through dominance, but through suffering. The vulnerable narcissist does not dominate you openly. They exhaust you quietly, with their endless needs, their fragility, their capacity to make everything about themselves, and their extraordinary skill at positioning themselves as the victim of every situation, regardless of their actual role in creating it. Both types cause profound damage in close relationships, and both types are extraordinarily difficult to identify, particularly in the early stages of the relationship when the patterns are still emerging. Chapter 2. The Narcissistic Relationship Cycle. Idealize, devalue, discard. If you have been in a relationship with a highly narcissistic person, romantic, familial, or professional, there is a pattern you will recognize immediately. It has 3 phases, and understanding those 3 phases is one of the most clarifying and most liberating things a person who has experienced narcissistic relationship dynamics can do. Phase 1. Idealization. In the beginning, sometimes called the honeymoon phase, sometimes called love bombing in the context of romantic relationships, the narcissist presents you with a version of themselves that is extraordinary, charming, attentive, extraordinarily interested in you. They make you feel chosen, genuinely, specifically, overwhelmingly chosen in a way that fills something deep and important. And they present you with a vision of the relationship, of what you will be together, of how special and rare and important what you have is. This phase feels real because, in a sense, it is real. The narcissist is not entirely performing. They are genuinely excited by the novelty of the connection, by your admiring reflection of them, by the potential they see in you to meet the deep and insatiable need for validation that drives everything they do. Phase 2. Devaluation. The idealization phase ends almost always and is replaced by something that feels, to the target, like a complete personality transplant. The warmth becomes coldness, the admiration becomes criticism, the interest becomes boredom or contempt. The partner who once seemed to cherish every word you said now barely seems to register your existence or registers it primarily as a source of irritation. The devaluation phase is where the manipulation tactics examined in our Dark Psychology audiobook are most fully deployed. gaslighting, silent treatment, triangulation, intermittent reinforcement. The target, who had experienced the extraordinary high of the idealization phase and is now experiencing its withdrawal, works desperately and compulsively to get back to the version of the relationship that existed in phase 1. This is precisely the response the devaluation phase is designed to produce, whether consciously or not. Phase 3. Discard. In some narcissistic relationships, the cycle ends with a discard, the abrupt, often brutal termination of the relationship, frequently for a new partner who is currently in the idealization phase that the previous partner has exhausted. The discard can be shocking in its speed and apparent lack of feeling. The relationship that seemed to matter so much, that the narcissist spoke about so intensely during idealization, is dropped with what appears to be no grief, no ambivalence, and no regret. This apparent emotional absence is not evidence that the relationship never mattered. It is evidence of the narcissist's fundamental difficulty with emotional object permanence, the psychological capacity to maintain a positive feeling about someone who is not currently reflecting them positively. In many narcissistic relationships, the cycle does not end in a single discard. It repeats. Idealize, devalue, partial discard or threat of discard, re-idealization, devalue again. The cycle can continue for years, keeping the target in a state of chronic uncertainty, chronic hope, and chronic grief simultaneously. Understanding the cycle does not make it less painful, but it makes it legible. And legibility, the ability to see the pattern for what it is rather than experiencing it as a series of mysterious, inexplicable events, is the beginning of the path out. Chapter 3. The 9 Warning Signs: How to Identify a Narcissist. The clinical diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, as listed in the DSM-5, require 5 or more of 9 specific characteristics. We are going to go through all 9, not as a checklist for diagnosing anyone, that is not what this is, but as a map of the behavioral patterns to watch for. 1. A grandiose sense of self-importance. They consistently exaggerate their achievements and talents. They expect to be recognized as superior without necessarily having the accomplishments to justify it. They talk about themselves and their accomplishments in ways that seem disproportionate to the actual evidence. 2. Preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Their self-narrative is organized around an idealized version of themselves and their future, a version that rarely matches the actual trajectory of their life. 3. Belief in their own specialness. They believe they are special and unique and can only be understood by or should only associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. The implication is always that ordinary people, ordinary places, ordinary experiences are beneath them. 4. A need for excessive admiration. Not ordinary appreciation, excessive, constant, reliable admiration. The good mood of a highly narcissistic person is directly and visibly correlated with the supply of admiration they are receiving. When that supply drops, through criticism, through inattention, through anyone else in the room receiving more attention than they are, the mood drops with it. 5. A sense of entitlement. Unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with their expectations. Rules that apply to everyone else do not apply to them. Waiting in line is for other people. Consideration for others' feelings is something they receive, not something they offer. 6. Interpersonal exploitation. They take advantage of others to achieve their own ends, often without recognizing or caring about the impact on the person being exploited. Relationships are primarily valued for their utility. 7. Lack of empathy. This is perhaps the defining characteristic and the one that causes the most damage in close relationships, not an inability to understand what others feel. Some narcissists are extraordinarily skilled at reading emotional states, but an inability or unwillingness to genuinely care about those feelings in any sustained way that costs them something. 8. envy of others, or belief that others are envious of them. They frequently assume that others envy their success, their intelligence, their status, and they themselves experience intense envy toward people who have what they want, often expressed as contempt or dismissal rather than acknowledged directly. 9. Arrogant and haughty behaviors and attitudes. A general air of superiority that permeates their interactions in how they speak about others, how they respond to perceived slights, how they carry themselves in environments where their status is not automatically confirmed. 5 or more of these characteristics present consistently across multiple contexts over an extended period. That is the clinical picture. But remember, you do not need 5 of 9 to recognize that a relationship is causing you harm. You need your own perception, your own experience, your own honest assessment of what the consistent pattern of someone's behavior has done to your sense of self. Chapter 4. Narcissistic Supply. What they actually want from you. To understand why narcissists behave the way they do in relationships, you need to understand one concept above all others: narcissistic supply. The term, first developed by the psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel and later expanded by others, refers to the attention, admiration, validation, and emotional reactions that the narcissistic personality requires as a fundamental psychological necessity, not as a preference, as a necessity. The narcissist's sense of self, their felt sense of value, existence, and identity, is not internally generated and maintained the way it is for psychologically healthy individuals. It is externally dependent. It requires constant replenishment from outside sources. When narcissistic supply is abundant, when admiration, attention, and validation are flowing consistently, the narcissist can be extraordinarily pleasant, charming, engaging, even generous. The version of them that existed during the idealization phase is not a complete fabrication. It is the narcissist when their supply needs are met. When narcissistic supply drops, through criticism, through inattention, through the target establishing boundaries, or simply having needs of their own, the narcissist experiences what clinicians call narcissistic injury, a profound, destabilizing threat to the fragile self-structure that the grandiose presentation is built to protect. Narcissistic injury produces rage, withdrawal, punishing behavior, the silent treatment, sudden and dramatic devaluation of the person who caused the injury, even if that cause was something as minor as disagreeing in a conversation or being unavailable for a phone call. The disproportionality of the narcissistic injury response is one of the most confusing and most distressing aspects of narcissistic relationship dynamics. The target cannot understand how something so small produced a reaction so large. They spend enormous amounts of energy trying to identify what they did wrong because the assumption is always that something must have gone terribly wrong to produce a response of that magnitude. But the magnitude is not proportional to what you did. It is proportional to the threat to the narcissist's supply. Understanding this changes everything. Your job in a relationship with a narcissist is not to love them better, not to communicate more effectively, not to be more patient or more accommodating or more understanding. Your role, whether you agreed to it or not, is to be a supply source. And when you fail to perform that function, when you have needs of your own, when you establish limits, when you exist as a fully dimensional human being rather than a mirror reflecting their specialness back at them, you become a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That is the fundamental reality of the narcissistic relationship, and it is the reality that no amount of effort, love, or sacrifice on your part will change. Chapter 5. Narcissistic Abuse, What It Does to You. Narcissistic abuse is not always dramatic, it is not always visible, and it almost never looks, from the outside, like what it is. Because the primary tools of narcissistic abuse are psychological. They operate in the interior, in the private space of the relationship, in the small moments that would sound trivial described to anyone who was not there, but that accumulate over time into something that profoundly reshapes the target's sense of self, their relationship with reality, and their capacity to trust their own perceptions. The psychological consequences of prolonged narcissistic abuse are well documented in the clinical literature. Complex PTSD. Unlike standard PTSD, which typically develops in response to a single traumatic event, complex PTSD develops in response to prolonged, repeated traumatic experiences. The chronic unpredictability of the narcissistic relationship, the oscillation between warmth and coldness, idealization and devaluation, connection and abandonment, produces a sustained trauma response that over time becomes embedded in the nervous system. Symptoms include hypervigilance, a constant scanning of the environment for signs of danger, specifically the signs that the narcissist's mood is shifting in a threatening direction. Emotional dysregulation, difficulty managing emotional responses that were destabilized by years of having them manipulated, dismissed, or weaponized against you. Negative self-perception, the internalization of the narcissist's devaluing narrative as truth about yourself. Cognitive dissonance. The target of narcissistic abuse frequently experiences profound cognitive dissonance, holding simultaneously the belief that the person they are with is the person who made them feel more loved than they had ever felt in the idealization phase, and the belief that the person they are with is causing them deep and sustained harm. These two beliefs cannot both be true about the same person, and the effort of holding them simultaneously is exhausting and destabilizing. Loss of self. Perhaps the most pervasive and most devastating consequence of prolonged narcissistic abuse is the gradual erosion of the target's sense of self, their values, their preferences, their sense of what they deserve, their trust in their own perceptions and judgments. The narcissistic relationship requires the target to organize their entire existence around the narcissist's needs, moods, and narratives. Over time, through a combination of intermittent reinforcement, gaslighting, isolation, and the constant implicit message that their needs and perspectives are unimportant, the target loses contact with who they were before the relationship. This is sometimes called self-loss in the clinical literature, and it is one of the reasons that leaving a narcissistic relationship, even when the target recognizes how damaging it is so profoundly difficult. Because the self that would make the decision to leave has been so thoroughly dismantled. You are not weak for having stayed. You are not stupid for having believed. You are not broken for having loved someone who did not know how to love you back. You are a person whose fundamental psychological needs were systematically exploited by someone who had become extraordinarily skilled at doing exactly that. And the path out begins with understanding that. Chapter 6. The Narcissist in the Family, when it is someone you cannot simply leave. Everything we have discussed so far has implicit assumptions built into it. The assumption that the narcissist is a romantic partner, someone you chose, someone you can unchoose. But narcissism does not limit itself to romantic relationships. For millions of people, the narcissist in their life is a parent, a sibling, a child, a family member whose presence in their life was never a choice, and whose removal from it carries consequences that go far beyond the simple decision to leave a romantic partnership. Narcissistic parenting deserves its own complete examination because its effects are uniquely profound and uniquely complicated. The narcissistic parent does not experience their child as a separate human being with their own needs, feelings, perspectives, and inherent worth. They experience their child as an extension of themselves, a reflection, a source of supply. The child of a narcissistic parent is assigned a role very early, often before they have the cognitive capacity to understand what is happening. Some children are assigned the role of the golden child, the idealized extension of the narcissistic parent's own grandiose self-image. celebrated, favored, and apparently valued, but in reality loved not for who they are, but for what they reflect back. Others are assigned the role of the scapegoat, the target onto whom the narcissistic parent projects their own rejected self. Criticized, blamed, minimized, and held responsible for the family's dysfunction in a way that is both unjust and, to the child, utterly disorienting. The adult child of a narcissistic parent frequently arrives at adulthood carrying a specific and deeply embedded set of psychological patterns: people-pleasing, hypervigilance to the emotional states of others, difficulty identifying and expressing their own needs, a chronic sense of never being quite enough, an attraction, sometimes compulsive, to relationships that replicate the familiar dynamic of the narcissistic family, because that dynamic, however painful, feels like home. The narcissistic sibling operates through different dynamics: competition, triangulation, and the exploitation of family loyalty, but produces similarly lasting effects. The narcissistic employer or colleague operates in the professional arena, using the power structures of the workplace to access narcissistic supply through dominance, credit-taking, and the exploitation of employees whose economic vulnerability makes resistance costly. In all of these contexts, where the narcissist cannot simply be left, the strategies required are different from those available in a romantic relationship. The goal is not removal, but management, not escape, but protection, and the primary tool is what therapists working with narcissistic family survivors call the gray rock method: becoming as uninteresting and unresponsive as possible as a supply source, providing neither the positive mirroring nor the emotional reaction that feeds the narcissistic dynamic. Chapter 7. Why You Stay. The Psychology of Narcissistic Trauma Bonding. Of all the questions that people outside narcissistic relationships ask with varying degrees of compassion, the most common is this: why do you stay? It is a question that carries, sometimes unintentionally, an implication of personal failure, as if staying were a simple choice being made poorly, as if the people who remain in narcissistic relationships lack the intelligence or self-respect to do something more obviously in their interest. This question fundamentally misunderstands what is happening. Staying in a narcissistic relationship is not a failure of intelligence. It is the predictable outcome of a specific and well-documented psychological process called trauma bonding. Trauma bonding, a term developed by psychologist Patrick Carnes based on earlier work on what was called Stockholm Syndrome, refers to the strong emotional attachment that develops between a victim and their abuser as a result of the cycle of abuse and intermittent reinforcement. We examined intermittent reinforcement in depth in our Dark Psychology audiobook experience. In the narcissistic relationship, it operates with particular power, because the reinforcement that punctuates the abuse is not just reward in the abstract sense, it is love, or what feels like love. The return of the idealization, the moments of warmth and connection and being seen that make the target feel that the relationship they fell in love with still exists somewhere underneath the pain. These moments are neurologically real. The dopamine released during the warm phases of the narcissistic cycle is genuine dopamine. The oxytocin of the reconnection is genuine oxytocin. The brain does not distinguish between earned and manipulated affection at the neurochemical level. And the alternation, warmth and withdrawal, connection and abandonment, idealization and devaluation produces exactly the variable ratio reinforcement schedule that behavioral psychology has demonstrated to be the most addiction-producing pattern available. You do not stay because you are weak. You stay because your nervous system has been conditioned through a process as neurologically powerful as substance addiction to seek relief from the pain of withdrawal in the only place it has ever found it, in the moments of warmth from the very person causing the pain. This is trauma bonding, And understanding it, naming it, and seeing it as a neurological process rather than a personal failing is one of the most important steps on the path toward genuine freedom. Chapter 8. Narcissistic Rage. What happens when you challenge them? There is a specific response that almost everyone who has ever challenged, confronted, or simply disappointed a highly narcissistic person has encountered. It is disproportionate. It is shocking in its intensity. It seems, to the person on the receiving end, completely disconnected from whatever triggered it. This is narcissistic rage. Narcissistic rage is not ordinary anger. Ordinary anger is a proportional emotional response to a genuine grievance. It has a specific cause, it seeks a specific resolution, and it subsides when the grievance is addressed. Narcissistic rage is fundamentally different in character. It arises not from a genuine grievance, but from narcissistic injury, the threat to the fragile self-structure that lies beneath the grandiose presentation. And its primary function is not resolution, but punishment, the restoration of the narcissist's sense of power and superiority through the complete submission of the person who caused the injury. It can take two forms. Explosive rage, the immediate, dramatic, overwhelming expression of fury, screaming, insults, threats, physical intimidation in severe cases that leaves the target shocked, frightened, and desperately focused on ending the episode rather than addressing whatever originally triggered it. Cold rage, more calculated, more sustained, more dangerous in many ways because it is harder to name and harder to protect against. The extended silent treatment, the systematic undermining of the target's reputation with third parties, the quiet, deliberate campaign of punishment that operates under the radar of obvious abuse while causing profound damage. Both forms serve the same function, to communicate, unmistakably, the cost of challenging or failing to supply the narcissist. And both forms succeed in their primary purpose when the target responds by backing down, apologizing, and modifying their behavior to prevent a recurrence. Understanding narcissistic rage, knowing it is coming when you assert yourself, knowing what it is when it arrives, does not make it less frightening, but it removes the confusion that is part of its power. When you know that the rage is a response to narcissistic injury rather than to something you actually did wrong, when you can name it as a manipulation tactic rather than experiencing it as evidence of your own culpability, you have something that the rage is designed to prevent you from having: clarity. And clarity is the beginning of freedom. Chapter 9. Setting boundaries with a narcissist. What actually works? Let us have an honest conversation about boundaries and narcissists, because there is a significant amount of advice in the self-help and therapeutic space about setting boundaries with narcissists that is, with the best intentions, not entirely accurate about what is actually possible. The standard advice about boundaries assumes something that is true in most interpersonal contexts, that when you clearly communicate a limit, when you say, "This behavior is not acceptable, and here is the consequence if it continues," the other person will hear that limit, respect it, and modify their behavior accordingly. This assumption does not hold with highly narcissistic individuals. Not because limits are ineffective in principle, but because the narcissistic personality structure experiences limits not as reasonable interpersonal information, but as narcissistic injury, as a challenge to their entitlement, a threat to their supply, and an act of aggression that demands a response. When you set a boundary with a narcissist, they do not typically think, "This person has communicated a limit and I should respect it." They typically think, "This person is trying to control me, withhold from me, or establish dominance over me, and I need to reassert my position." What this means practically is that boundaries with narcissists must be enforced, not simply stated. A stated boundary that is not enforced is not a boundary. It is information that you can be pushed past without consequence. And narcissists are extraordinarily skilled at finding and testing the exact point at which stated limits dissolve. Effective limits with narcissistic individuals have specific characteristics. They are behavioral rather than emotional. Not, "I need you to be kinder to me," which invites debate about what kindness means and whether you deserve it, but, "If you speak to me that way, I will leave the room." Specific, behavioral, enforceable. They are followed through on, every single time, without exception, because one exception, one instance of the threatened consequence not materializing, communicates that the limit is negotiable, and negotiable limits are not limits at all. They are set for yourself, rather than to change the narcissist. The most important shift in understanding limits with narcissistic individuals is the recognition that the limit is not a request for them to change. It is a decision about what you will and will not participate in. You cannot control their behavior. You can control your response to it. And sometimes, the most honest and most necessary boundary is the one that says, "I will not continue in this relationship under these conditions." Chapter 10. The Gray Rock Method: How to Become Boring to a Narcissist. When leaving is not immediately possible, when the narcissist is a co-parent, a family member, or a colleague whose presence in your life cannot be immediately eliminated, there is a strategy that has been widely adopted by survivors of narcissistic relationships and validated by therapists working in this space. It is called the Gray Rock Method. The principle is elegant in its simplicity. A narcissist feeds on supply, on emotional reactions, on drama, on the sense that they have the power to affect you. Remove the supply, and you remove the incentive for escalated manipulation. The Gray Rock Method involves making yourself as unremarkable, as emotionally unresponsive, and as genuinely uninteresting as a gray rock as your primary strategy for managing unavoidable contact with a narcissistic individual. Specifically, give minimal responses. Yes, no, I will check my schedule. Short, flat, informationally complete, but emotionally vacant responses that provide nothing for the narcissist to engage with, react to, or escalate from. Share nothing personal. No information about your emotional life, your relationships, your achievements, your struggles, your plans. Not because you are hiding, but because personal information is supply. It is material that can be used to manipulate, triangulate, or simply provide the emotional engagement that feeds the narcissistic dynamic. Respond to provocations with boredom, not with anger, which is supply, not with hurt, which is supply, not with elaborate justification, which is supply. With the flattest, most uninterested, most genuinely disengaged response you can authentically produce. Maintain this consistently, not in dramatic emotional moments only, but as a baseline mode of engagement with this person. The Gray Rock Method is not permanent. It is a protective strategy for contexts where contact is unavoidable and supply removal is the most effective protection available. It is also, let us be honest, emotionally demanding to execute. Maintaining emotional flatness in the face of provocations designed to elicit a reaction requires a level of self-regulation that takes practice, support, and ongoing attention to your own emotional well-being. Which brings us to the part that the Gray Rock Method alone cannot address: what you need to heal. Chapter 11. Healing from Narcissistic Abuse: The Real Work. Leaving the narcissistic relationship, physically if you are able, is not the end of the work. For many survivors, it is the beginning of the most difficult part. Because the relationship does not end when the contact ends. It continues, in the patterns it installed, in the self-doubts it cultivated, in the hypervigilance it produced, in the distorted beliefs about what you deserve and what is possible for you that it embedded so deeply they feel like your own thoughts, rather than the residue of someone else's campaign. Healing from narcissistic abuse is real and possible. Thousands of people have done it. Many of them describe the process not just as recovery from damage, but as genuine expansion, as finally meeting themselves, often for the first time, without the distorting lens of the narcissistic relationship. But it is not quick, and it is not linear. The work of healing from narcissistic abuse typically involves several distinct areas. Rebuilding self-trust. The gaslighting, the reality distortion, the constant messaging that your perceptions and judgments were unreliable, all of this has eroded your ability to trust yourself. Rebuilding this trust is slow and evidence-based. It comes from making small decisions and discovering that your judgment was sound, from noticing your feelings and discovering that they are reliable guides rather than problems to be managed. Processing grief. The narcissistic relationship produces a specific and complex grief for the person you thought you were with during the idealization phase, for the relationship you believed you were in, for the years invested, for the version of yourself that existed before. This grief is real, and it deserves to be honored, not rushed. Identifying and releasing internalized beliefs. The narcissist's devaluing narrative that you are too sensitive, too needy, too difficult, not good enough, undeserving, often becomes internalized as your own self-assessment. Identifying these beliefs as installed rather than innate, examining them with curiosity rather than accepting them as truth, is some of the most important work of healing. Reconnecting with yourself. With the preferences, values, desires, and ways of being in the world that existed before the relationship and that still exist underneath everything the relationship layered over them. The self was not destroyed, it was suppressed, and it is waiting to be rediscovered. Building safe connections. The narcissistic relationship distorts your template for intimacy. Rebuilding the capacity to trust, to allow genuine connection while maintaining the discernment to recognize when a dynamic is unsafe, is both challenging and essential. Professional support, specifically from a therapist familiar with narcissistic abuse and its effects, is not a luxury in this process. It is, for many people, the difference between going through the motions of recovery and actually healing. Chapter 12. How to never get trapped again. Building narcissism immunity. The question that every person who has been through a narcissistic relationship eventually asks, sometimes with self-reproach, always with genuine urgency, is this: how do I make sure this never happens to me again? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable, but it is available. And it is the most important investment you can make in your own future. Building what some therapists call narcissism immunity, the capacity to recognize narcissistic dynamics early and protect yourself from them, involves work in several areas. Know your vulnerabilities. Narcissists are extraordinarily skilled at identifying and targeting specific psychological vulnerabilities: the need for validation, the fear of abandonment, the compulsion to fix and heal others, the deep hunger for a specific kind of love that was unavailable in childhood. These vulnerabilities are not character flaws. They are human experiences, but they are the entry points through which narcissistic manipulation gains access. Knowing your specific vulnerabilities, working with them consciously, getting support in healing the wounds they represent dramatically reduces the degree to which they can be exploited. Learn to recognize love bombing in real time. The idealization phase of the narcissistic relationship is both the most intoxicating and the most reliable early warning sign. Intensity that is disproportionate to actual duration, pressure toward rapid commitment, language of destiny and uniqueness very early, resistance to the normal pace of relationship development. These are not signs of exceptional connection. They are signs of supply seeking. Genuine connection does not require compression. It deepens naturally over time, at a pace that allows both people to be fully known, rather than simply intensely experienced. Trust the pattern over the exception. The intermittent reinforcement cycle creates a cognitive bias towards the exceptional moments, the warmth, the connection, the version of the person you fell in love with, and away from the consistent pattern of behavior over time. Reverse this. When assessing a relationship, trust the consistent baseline behavior rather than the exceptional high moments. Anyone can be extraordinary on a good day. Character is revealed in how someone treats you on an ordinary Tuesday, when nothing special is at stake and they have nothing to gain from performing. Build and maintain your own life. The narcissistic relationship thrives in the space created by your isolation and your emotional dependence. A person with a full life, with genuine friendships, with activities and interests that are their own, with financial independence and professional identity, is a far less vulnerable target than someone whose social world has contracted around a single relationship. Not because fullness makes you immune, but because fullness gives you perspective, support, and the practical resources that make leaving possible when leaving is necessary. And finally, do the inner work. The most reliable protection against narcissistic relationships in the future is the healing of the wounds that made you vulnerable to them in the first place. The childhood experiences that installed the beliefs about love and worth that the narcissists exploited. The attachment patterns that make certain relationship dynamics feel like home, even when they are destroying you. This work is deep. It is long. It is sometimes painful, and it is the most important thing you will ever do for yourself. Because the person who knows their worth, genuinely, stably, not contingently, the person whose sense of self is internally grounded rather than externally dependent, is the person who does not need the narcissist's validation enough to stay when the validation turns to destruction. That person is who you are becoming, right now, by understanding exactly what was done to you and refusing to let it define what is possible for you. You are not here by accident. You found this audiobook experience because some part of you already knows something, knows that what you have been experiencing is real, knows that the confusion and self-doubt and exhaustion are not evidence of your inadequacy, they are evidence of what has been done to you. Share this with someone who has been saying something feels wrong but cannot explain what, who has been apologizing for things they did not do for longer than they should have. Subscribe to the audiobook space for a new audiobook experience every week. Until next time, see clearly, trust yourself, you are worth protecting.